This video has been a long time coming, but I'm going to share the things I learned doing the 12 Days of Animation challenge. This was a challenge to use all the 12 principles of animation in 12 days. I'm going to cover each principle briefly. This isn't necessarily a tutorial. I've also linked a really awesome video explaining each principle in detail, so if you want to dive deeper, that'll be there for you too. The principle I chose to do first was squash and stretch. This is where a character or object changes shape in accordance to its environment or to imply emotion. For example, a drop of water will stretch out as it falls and picks up speed and then will squash down into a puddle once it comes into contact with the ground. There's also the classic example of a rubber ball that will squish when it hits the ground and stretch back out as it launches into the air. The amount of squash and stretch given to an animation will be up to the animator. It depends what sort of material the subject is made out of and how cartoony the animation is to be. For an animation to look believable and have weight, though, it needs to have some amount of squash and stretch. My short animation was definitely over-exaggerated. I think I would be more subtle next time, but I learned how the principle can add just a little bit more character and life to an animation. The next principle is a very important one for making the animation easy to follow and believable. That is anticipation. This principle is just what it sounds like, showing the start of an animation, giving the viewer a clue as to what the character will do next. This can look like a baseball player winding up before a throw, a character looking off to the side before the camera pans, or in this case, a dragon taking a big breath before breathing flames. You can't simply lift off from the ground without first preparing for the jump. It would look unnatural. If the world your animation is taking place is any kind of physics, you'll want to implement anticipation. I think this principle can also be applied to making an animation easier to follow. If the viewer doesn't see clearly what action is taking place, the animation can kind of become confusing and messy looking. This leads really well into staging, which is also just what it sounds like. So staging is when you are setting up the environment to better show the action. This makes the animation easy to follow. Think of it as leading the eye of the viewer. I wanted to create a simple animation of a cat knocking over a plant, as they do. So instead of just having the action happen right away and too quickly, I wanted to make it very clear. First, I wanted the viewer to notice the plant. Then I wanted the viewer to notice the cat. I also want the action to seem slightly mischievous, but in a curious, innocent sort of way. To do this, I had the cat notice the pot, trot over to it, and then take a moment to study the plant. Then, in a haphazard way, knock the pot off just to watch it fall. After creating this animation, I see some more things I could have improved upon to better stage it. Maybe I should have had the cat study the plant more, and maybe play with the flower and gradually increase intensity until the pot was eventually knocked off the fence. But I only had a day to complete the animation, so there was only so much refining I could do. One of the reasons this video is so late is because I have been trying to decide on the future of my channel. Videos like this don't necessarily go with the animated shorts side of my channel. I have been thinking about splitting up my channel and putting animations on one and more talking videos on another. Anyways, it's just a thought, and if you think that makes sense or want me to keep everything on one, just let me know in the comments. Next is a principle that is more of a how to actually animate sort of principle. This is pose-to-pose animation and straight ahead. Both of these methods are used for different things. Pose-to-pose animation is usually used for more complex movements when you are trying to hit certain beats of a pose. My example is this stingray animation. I used pose-to-pose to animate the main movement of the ray. I first blocked in the main poses that would sell the movement, then I added my in-betweens that would smooth out the animation and create a better timing. Straight ahead animation is better for movements that need to look very organic and don't really require hitting specific poses to be readable. My example for this is splashing water. I animated the water just as I wanted it to happen, following each drop's path one frame at a time instead of blocking out where I wanted the drop to land. Most animations use a mix of both pose-to-pose and straight-ahead animation to keep characters consistent, but also add organic movement. The next principle I chose was follow-through. This is where an appendage, accessory, or the like is dragged along with the main body. Then, due to momentum and its lighter weight, will still move when the body has stopped. Here's an example. The antenna of a character's head will follow the head wherever it goes, dragging a few moments behind. If the head suddenly stops, the antennae would continue forward and settle back into its resting position. This happens with feathers, tails, long ears, capes, anything that is sort of floppy and lighter than the main moving body. How light the object is and whether or not it is an appendage with muscle will determine how much follow-through it has. A loose feather will have more follow-through than a cattail reed. Follow-through is a key fundamental to making animations appear to be in a real world of physics and weight. This principle also applies to the bodies of characters. If a bird lands on a branch, the momentum of flight will need to follow through before the bird settles into its final position. Another fundamental that I really recommend learning early is slow in and slow out. If all the other ones seem a little bit too complicated, this one may be the best place to start. Almost all movements abide by this rule unless you are animating something that is mechanical. Actions need a slow in and slow out for the same reasons we were discussing about anticipation. Just like you can't jump without bending your joints, you can't perform an action without some period of time to build up speed or slow down. In my example, a sea otter is diving, then slowing down upon seeing the crab, then picking up speed as it swims away. Notice how it doesn't immediately resume speed, but has to build it back up. The seventh day was arcs. This is a very natural movement that adds flow to your animations. An arc is the path a movement will follow. If a character is landing from a jump, their body may follow through in an arc. Remember, we talked about follow-through. This principle can be used to make the follow-through of weight even more believable. If a character is turning their head or swinging a sword, it should follow an arc. Sometimes the easiest way to do this is to simply draw a line of action under your animation, so there is a guide. My example of arcs was this dragon that landed and the follow-through made a tiny arc, but also the movement of the head looking down makes an arc as well. Next is secondary action. This is any movement that supports the main action. For my animation, it's a roadrunner, running. I know, so original. The primary action is the running, and the secondary is everything else. Secondary action is often used to convey emotion or environmental factors. The wings twitching can show the flighty anxiety of a bird, and the cheek fluff and tail bobbing is simply to show the weight of the feathers and how they bounce with each step. Remember, the secondary action shouldn't overrun the primary action. Give both their space and time to be seen. The actions don't need to happen at the same time either. The secondary action is to convey more dimension and movement. This relates to staging. If you want the viewer to catch something in your animation, you will need to give it the appropriate time on screen. We've talked a lot about animating characters, but you actually have to have a character to animate. Appeal is a principle that isn't necessarily about the movement of a character, but the character themselves. Appeal essentially means that the character should be somewhat pleasing to look at. This doesn't have to mean beautiful, but they should be interesting to look at. To do this, you want to add variety in your shape language and use it to convey something about the character. This is like the drawing principle exaggeration, not to be confused with the animation principle exaggeration. They mean slightly different things depending on what medium of art you're talking about. For drawing, it means pushing your character and exaggerating the areas you want to be noticed. For my example, I wanted to create a bat that focused on being cute. I enlarged the areas of the bat that make people most recognize it as a bat. The ears and the little fangs. I also made the eyes big to add more personality and cuteness. I then made the feet look more like paws because we associate paws with animals that are often very loved, like cats and dogs. Alright, let's move on to timing, which is another one of those principles that has more to do with how to animate and less the actual drawings. Timing is referred to how many frames are in between each main action. Depending on the number of frames, the story you are trying to convey will change. For example, this iguana with only 2 or even 4 frames looks like he's quite distressed or angry, but if we add more frames in between the push-up, it becomes more controlled or wary. So an easy way to think of it is that if you have many frames close together between the beginning and the end of an action, then it will be slow. But if you have less frames and further apart, the action will be fast. And yes, iguanas actually do push-ups. It's ridiculous and adorable. The next principle kind of combines the last two, and that is exaggerated movement, similar to character exaggeration in drawing. This is where an animator will push the movement or an idea to its extreme. The more extreme, the more impact on the viewer. This makes what is happening very clear. When trying to convey an emotion, you want it to be unmistakable. You want whatever you are trying to convey to be very convincing. There is also a second part to exaggeration, and that is exaggerating individual frames. This is often used for when someone is surprised. You may implement some extreme squash and stretch to convey this. Like timing, the less frames you have, the quicker the movement. If you want the exaggerated frame to be very noticeable, make it stay on screen longer. The last principle I did also was just lumped into this animation, and that is solid drawing. It's easy to explain, but it can be somewhat hard to achieve. Essentially, you are trying to make your animations feel somewhat 3D, that they exist in an actual world and aren't made of paper, unless that's the look you're going for. A good way to practice this is to do a character turnaround, where your subject will spin in a circle like it's on a potter's wheel. To do this, you draw each frame at a different angle as if they are 3D. Okay, and that is all 12 principles. You may have noticed that every animation uses more than one principle. That's because it's pretty hard to animate something only using one. If you're new to animating, you probably already use several of these principles without even realizing it. Even though I've used some of these fundamentals, my animations have improved because I can actually keep track of these principles in my head a lot better. If you haven't yet tried making an animation to practice each principle, I'd recommend it, and try to get a better grasp on the uses of each one. I was also thinking of making a video with a specific project in mind, like how to animate a wing flapping. Is that something that would interest you? If you have any ideas, let me know and I can consider them. Thanks for watching and good luck with your animations.